Ascendai, The Destiny Crest. Audiobook by Robinson and Walsh. Chapter 5, Disappointment. Montgomery Vanderhaven paced the floor of the penthouse apartment. It was the same room that his sons were staying in before the catastrophe, and it looked as if they had just stepped out for a while and would be back any minute. Their clothes were still hanging in the closets, and there were video game controllers and empty soda cans sitting haphazardly on the coffee table in front of the large screen TV. The resort had been evacuated of all the guests to make room for the rescue operation, but ordinary rules had never applied to Vanderhaven. He had arranged to come and stay there soon after learning of the avalanche and the disappearance of his sons. He stopped in front of the wall of windows and took a sip of brandy as he looked down at the chaos of the scene in front of him. Rescue teams were coming and going constantly on foot, snowmobile, and helicopter. News stations and paparazzi jockeyed for the best position outside of the roped-off area, shouting for interviews, as flashbulbs went off every second. Most of the cameras were focused on an area near the large door to the hotel, and Vanderhaven knew the boy must be there. The story had intensified dramatically since the rescue of the young boy. He sighed and resumed pacing impatiently. The company's image was dramatically declining, and he knew that he couldn't wait any longer. It's time for me to turn this negative publicity around. He grabbed his phone and called down to the rescue operation, looking for any news of his sons that hadn't been released to the press yet. He was worried for their safety, but had managed to keep his mind busy trying to battle the negativity. As he hung up his phone, frustrated with the lack of any new news, the story of young Colt Connors came on the television again. They told of how he had spent most of his life as an orphan, and with the loss of his family, he would now become an orphan again. The story was disheartening. There was no one left to take care of him, and he didn't have a single dime to his name. The boy's future looked bleak. "I've got it," Vanderhaven said to himself. He turned to his assistant and said, "Schedule a press conference for later this evening." "What about?" his assistant asked. "Just do it," Vanderhaven said testily as he turned back to the television. "And get my attorney on the phone," he added. "I've worked too hard to get where I am for this to bring me down," he thought to himself. "I'll do whatever it takes to keep my company safe." Cole stared out the large window on the front of the lodge, his eyes fixed on the slope below him. 3 days had passed since he had been rescued, and there was still no word on his mother and sisters. His head ached and his eyes felt gritty from lack of sleep. He could hear the helicopters and shouting voices from over near the hotel, where the base of operations was set up, but he didn't take his eyes off the scene in front of him. He had spent the whole first day after his rescue over there in the thick of things. He had run to every returning search party praying for good news. Hour after hour he had been disappointed, as the only thing that came off the helicopters had been body bags. He had felt his heart start to race and his stomach clench every time he had seen one. There was no peace in the moment for him until he was told that it wasn't his family. Each time he would let out a sigh of relief and then return to his post, waiting hopefully until the next crew returned. Every time he turned around, cameras went off, the flash blinding him. Well-meaning rescue workers and volunteers hovered around him, asking questions and telling him, "It's going to be okay." He was polite to everyone, but he wanted to yell out in frustration, "It's not okay, and it won't be okay until we find them." By mid-morning of the second day, he thought, "If one more person pats me on the head and tells me it will be all right, I'm going to explode." He took off, walking blindly, not caring where he went as long as it was away. As Colt walked, he felt his fists slowly unclench and his body start to relax. He took a deep breath and looked around. He had ended up in front of the massive lodge. Half of the slope in front of him was untouched, the other half was completely destroyed, with most of the damage from the avalanche on the adjoining mountain. He climbed the stairs of a huge deck and pulled a chair to the railing and sat. He heard someone approaching and turned to see Carl run up to him, breathing heavily. "Man, I thought we lost you," he said as he leaned over and put his hands on his knees as he tried to catch his breath. "You okay?" "Yes, sir," Colt replied. "I just wanted to be alone for a while." Carl looked him over carefully. "Everyone's been all over you, huh?" Well, kinda. They don't mean to. You're just kind of everyone's miracle boy right now." "I just needed a little peace and quiet so I could think," he said as he continued staring over the railing. Carl was quiet for a moment. Colt could feel his eyes on him. "Don't worry, son," Carl said gruffly. "I won't let anyone else bother you." Since then, Colt had spent most of his time in the lodge with Carl or one or two of Carl's friends from the rescue teams. They spent their spare time taking turns sitting in the huge room with Colt, keeping anyone from bothering him. Even now, Colt knew that whenever he turned around, that he would see someone a couple of tables back watching over him. He heard some footsteps behind him, and John, the man in charge of the rescue operation, pulled up a chair and sat down next to him. Carl came up behind him. Colt liked John. With the man's calm nature and obvious authority, mixed with an easy smile, he reminded him of his father. John would often come down and sit with him during his breaks. He never tried to get him to talk or told him everything would be okay. He just sat there, lending support as Colt rode the roller coaster of emotions, from anger and frustration to intense pain and denial as he wrestled to accept the fact that his father was dead and the rest of his family's fate was unknown. "Have you found them yet?" Colt asked, holding his breath. "No news yet, son," John replied, "but there is a lady here from the state that wants to see you. She's over by the fireplace, and I think you should talk to her." "Is she going to make me leave?" Colt asked, worried. "I'm not sure. I think she may just want to see how you are." Colt looked at him with reservation. "All right, I'll talk to her." He took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. "But I'm not leaving," he added quietly. John and Carl followed him as he walked towards the huge fireplace in the center of the lodge. The large building was mostly empty, except for a few volunteers and rescue workers sitting around in small groups talking or eating. The news crews weren't allowed down there, so it was a hideout for those looking for quiet. A middle-aged woman in a dark gray suit sat in one of the plush chairs, looking through a file in her hands. She looked up and smiled as Colt walked up to her. "Hello, you must be Colt. My name is Mary, and I'm with the Department of Children's Services." "Hello," Colt said politely and sat down facing her. John and Carl sat down at a nearby table only a couple of feet away, acting as though they were quietly talking, but they were actually trying to hear what the woman had come to say. "How are you?" she asked kindly. "I'm fine, thank you," he answered. She cleared her voice. "The church you are a member of in Tennessee is having a memorial service for your father, and they asked if you would be willing to come. I know this is hard for you to think about right now, but I think this is something that you should really consider doing." Colt felt tears threaten as he thought of his father, but he refused to let them fall. "I can't," he said. "I need to be here for the rest of my family." He took a deep breath and let it out slowly, then nodded in agreement with his decision. "I think my dad would want me to be here for them." Mary looked at him as she shook her head sadly. "I understand," she said, "but you aren't going to be able to stay here much longer. You need someone to take good care of you." "I'm doing fine," Colt said firmly, "and when they find my mother, she'll take care of me," he added as his tone softened. "Son," she said sadly, reaching over and grabbing his hand, "I really hope they find her, but until they do, it's my job to see that you are safe." John had heard everything and immediately sprung out of his chair and came to stand beside Colt and said, "I'll take full responsibility for him. That is, if it's okay with you." Colt let out a sigh of relief when John had stood up for him. Mary looked up at them both and then stood up and said, "All right, I'm okay with him staying for a little while longer as long as he has adult supervision. This is probably as good a place as any for him right now anyway." "Why is that?" John looked puzzled. "Anywhere we put him right now will be a little crazy thanks to Montgomery Vanderhaven's little television announcement." John nodded with understanding. "He'll be fine. He's a good boy, and he has been no trouble at all." Colt was very confused but kept silent, afraid he'd slip up and say something that might make her change her mind. She packed Colt's file into her briefcase. "I'll be checking to see how you are doing in a day or so. Here's my card. If either of you need me, just give me a call." She shook John's hand and then Colt's. "Goodbye, Colt. I'll see you soon." Then she walked quickly out of the lodge. Colt released the pent-up breath he had been holding as the door swung shut behind her, then looked up at John. "Thank you," he said gratefully. John winked at him. "No problem, son. Just keep your head up and you'll get through this. I've got to get back to work. I'll check in with you later." He walked away, saying a quiet goodbye to Carl as he passed him. Colt dropped back into the chair, his heart and mind in turmoil. He was going to miss his dad's funeral. He hoped he hadn't let his dad down with that decision. I wonder what kind of announcements this Vander something guy made, and what's going to be crazy for me everywhere. I don't get it. The conversation was weird. Colt let his head fall back against the high back of the chair and he closed his eyes, too tired to think clearly anymore. He raised his head quickly again as he heard the name Vanderhaven from a large television in the corner of the lodge. He watched as his own face appeared, and then a picture of two young men flashed on the screen. He got up and walked closer as a well-dressed older man came on the screen and started talking. It was dark in the newscast and Colt could see the resort hotel lit up behind him. He was confused until he realized that it was a replay of something that had been recorded earlier. The man on the screen began to apologize for the carelessness of his sons and announced that he had set up a special fund through his company for Colt Connors, who was presumed to be the sole survivor of the avalanche. The amount of the fund was $150 million, which Colt would get when he turned 21. I know that money can't make up for the loss of Colt's family, but I hope it will at least help to make his life a little bit easier, Vanderhaven said sorrowfully. Then tears came to the man's eyes as he said, I truly hope that the experts are wrong. I hope that Colt's family is found and are safe. I also pray that my sons and others are recovered safely as well. Colt's mouth dropped. $150 million? He couldn't even comprehend that much money. Whoa, he couldn't help saying. That's a lot of money. I traded all to get my family back, he thought soberly. He stood mesmerized in front of the TV as the reporters told the story again of how Stan and George Vanderhaven with their friends had caused the avalanche. Anger coursed through him as he thought about how much their stupid stunt had cost him and so many other families. How could they do something so stupid? Colt said with rage in his eyes. Idiots, he mumbled. He was so caught up in his anger at the two young men that it took a moment for what he heard next to register. On the television, two men in suits were discussing that it was unlikely that any other survivors would be found. Any survivors have probably succumbed to the harsh elements by now, one man said. Yes, it will probably be springtime when everything thaws before they recover all the bodies, the other man agreed. I think young Colt Connors is going to remain the only survivor of this terrible tragedy. A picture of Colt flashed on the screen. He looked small and ragged as he clutched an old green pack in front of him and followed a covered stretcher as his father's remains were taken into the resort's hotel. It was a replay and reminder of the worst moment of his life. Alarmed by the experts' comments and distraught over the image they played of him following the gurney, Colt turned around quickly, refusing to see any more of the replay, and met the concerned gaze of Carl. I know what they're saying, Carl said softly, but we haven't given up. Colt took a deep breath and squared his shoulders as he nodded to Carl and walked back to the front of the lodge to resume his post. Montgomery Vanderhaven smiled gleefully as he watched the newscast from the penthouse apartment. I should have been an actor, he thought. His idea had worked. All the negative publicity had been turned around. The media now had him looking like a generous man filled with guilt over Colt's loss. The tears were a stroke of genius, he thought to himself with pride. That boy will never see a dime of my money. I'll take care of him when all this blows over. The constant sadness he had felt since losing his sons threatened to overwhelm him again. He hated that feeling. The sense of helplessness was new to him and made him feel weak and emasculated. He had found that the best way to combat it was to throw himself into his work. His assistant walked into the room and he turned his attention to what he was saying. We've been taking calls from several other people that have lost family members in the avalanche, he said. It looks like everyone wants to be paid off now. Vanderhaven shook his head in disgust. Just pay off the ones that you think will cause us the most trouble, he said. Not too much either. Keep it light. Are you sure, sir? Yes. If we don't make a stand, these moochers will never go away. You think that'll be enough? His assistant asked with skepticism clear in his voice. They are lucky to get a dime. I can't believe these people are trying to extort money from me. My hard-earned money. I didn't do this. Deadbeat losers disgust me, he said in revulsion. He turned back to the television just in time to see a picture of his two sons flash across the screen. His sons were the only thing, other than money, that he'd ever cared for, and he felt certain they were gone. Tears filled his eyes as sorrow rushed through him. He cleared his throat and impatiently wiped his eyes. He had always prided himself on his discipline, and he was disgusted with himself over the lack of self-control. Hardening his heart, he called for his assistant. It's time to get back to work. Colt sat numbly in the front pew of the church, staring dully at the large picture of his smiling family on the podium in front of him. He hurt so bad inside, he wondered if he would ever feel normal again. It had been 3 weeks since the avalanche. The search had been called off nearly a week ago. He remembered how angry he had been at John when he had told him that there would be no more search parties going out. Colt had stubbornly insisted that if everyone else was going to give up, he would just stay and look by himself. John had just stood there and let Colt yell until he had broken down and cried until there were no more tears left in him. Mary, the woman from DCS, had then come in and taken him to a local orphanage. The story of the avalanche had been huge in the news. Colt was now famous, and with the future inheritance of so much money from the Vanderhaven Company, the state had been bombarded with calls about adopting or fostering him. Colt didn't really remember most of that week. He just ate when someone told him to eat and went where people told him to go. He felt like he was walking in a fog, so full of pain and anger that he didn't really care what happened next. Memories of his family and the times they had shared ran through his mind constantly. Now, here he was at their funeral. It all seemed surreal. One local church, which was connected with the orphanage he was at, had put the funeral together for him. He could hear the clicking of camera shutters busily at work behind him, and he knew that there were several news cameras trained on him as well. When he arrived, he had to come in the back door of the church because there was a line full of people waiting to get in that stretched halfway down the block. Colt barely registered the noise. He was focused on the smiling faces of his father, mother, and sisters staring out from the picture in front of him. All through the service he kept his gaze fixed on them. For a boy that had spent nearly all his life with no one, he had never felt so alone. Colt was sitting on the swing hanging from the huge tree in the backyard of the orphanage. It was his favorite spot because he could see the mountain that the resort sat on far off in the distance. He had heard that the resort was closed down and that Vanderhaven was continuing to search for his boys, using his own people. At least somebody's not giving up, he thought. Colt still believed deep inside that his mother and sisters could still be alive, but he knew better than to voice that opinion out loud. It always got him looks of pity and a trip to see a counselor. He didn't understand why no one believed him. Ever since he had come off the mountain, he had felt compelled to return there, and that feeling grew stronger every day. He knew his family had to be alive and refused to believe anything else. He looked around as he heard someone calling his name. Mary was standing on the back porch, gesturing for him to come inside. Taking one more look at the mountain, he called, "I'm coming, ma'am." Then he ran towards the door. Mary led him into a small office and sat down behind the cluttered desk. Colt sat down in the small chair in front of it and watched as she shifted through the pile of papers on her desk. She finally found what she was looking for and looked up at Colt, smiling. "How are you today, Colt?" she asked. "Fine, ma'am. How are you?" he replied politely. "Well, I have some exciting news," she said. "We've decided it will be best for you if we send you back to the original orphanage from your childhood. We're not going to tell anyone about moving you there except for a few people that will be responsible for taking you there. If this plan works, it should get you out of the spotlight and away from the chaos of the paparazzi and from all the people that are coming forward trying to adopt you for the wrong reasons. Maybe there you will finally be able to get some peace. Plus, you'll be back in a familiar place." Smiling encouragingly at him, she asked, "How does that sound?" Colt's insides were churning wildly. "I can't go back to Tennessee. It's too far away from my family." But all he said was, "I'd rather stay here. I'm fine here." Mary looked at him sadly for a moment and then said slowly, "I'm sorry, son, but the decision has already been made. I know you want to stay here because it makes you feel close to your family, but you're going to have to accept the fact that they're gone." She sighed and came around the desk to put her arm around his shoulders as his eyes filled with tears. "I can't imagine what you're going through," she said, "but I really think that this is the best move for you. You're scheduled to leave tomorrow morning, so you need to go ahead and get your things together." Colt nodded and politely said, "Yes, ma'am," before walking quickly out of the room. Back in the large room where all the boys slept, he paced back and forth in front of his bed, his heart in turmoil. He reached down, grabbed his dad's old green pack from under the bed, and threw his clothes into it. Then he packed up the paperwork from Montgomery Vanderhaven's people and latched the pack securely. Frustrated and enraged, he decided that he had to do something. I don't care what everybody thinks. They have to be alive. I can't just leave. He began searching within for some genius plan to get Mary to let him stay. Finally, he decided that he was just wasting time that he didn't really have. She doesn't really care, trying to justify his next step. She never listens, he mumbled. He knew what he had to do. Tonight, when everyone else is asleep, I'm out of here.